I'm Captain Zach Blanchard, an instructor in the Political Science Department and the officer representative supporting Midshipman First Class Laura Spratling and her team for this conference. Dr. Francis Fukuyama is a Senior Fellow of International Studies at Stanford University. Throughout his career, Dr. Fukuyama's prescient analysis of a diverse set of large-scale social and political changes has made him one of the most referenced social scientists of our time, with just under 100,000 citations per Google Scholar. He has produced seminal work on topics ranging from the ideological implications of the Cold War's closing to the centrality of trust in facilitating economic growth and government performance. In recent years, Dr. Fukuyama has continued to shine a light on complex global socio-political threats before they have reached their zenith. His 2014 Political Order and Political Decay anticipated the growing distrust in political institutions across the West. His 2018 Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, analyzed the problems caused by our increasingly intense focus on political identity. This past summer, Dr. Fukuyama showed this foresight again with his Foreign Affairs article, The Pandemic and Political Order, which sought to identify the major consequences of the coronavirus pandemic before they reached fruition. Several of his predictions regarding the pandemic's impact on democratic institutions, political consensuses surrounding free markets, and the international relationships of the U.S. and China are proving themselves more accurate by the month. To create a more resilient international order, we must first perceive the shocks induced by the current crisis, and there are few people better suited to help us do that than Dr. Fukuyama. With this goal in mind, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our LeGros Address speaker, Dr. Francis Fukuyama, in conversation with our NAFAC Chief of Staff, Midshipman First Class Sam Paparo.
Hi, Dr. Fukuyama. Thank you for joining us for NAFAC 2021. We're very happy to have you.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to be invited.
Okay. I've outlined just kind of a conversation about some of the global impacts of the pandemic on the world order and some of the differences in how different countries have responded and how that will impact the future of the world order. So my first question is, you wrote fairly recently in Foreign Affairs that one of the indicators of how well or poorly different countries had responded to the pandemic was based on whether they had competent state apparatus, trusted government, and good leadership, regardless of whether it was an authoritarian or democratic system. Do you think that in total the pandemic has been a net win for liberal democracy, a net loss for liberal democracy, or sort of a net neutral?
Well, let me divide my answer into two parts. So the first is really the analysis of who did well. I wrote the article that you're referring to, I wrote in Foreign Affairs last June of 2020, when we were still at a fairly early point in the pandemic. And I must say, and I think this is something that's incumbent on all social observers, that I was wrong about some of that, because at that time it appeared that, for example, a number of countries in Northern Europe, like Germany or the Netherlands, were doing a lot better than, let's say, France or Italy or the United States. And, you know, since then, that's proven not to be true, that Europe today is actually in worse shape than the United States, despite what many people regard as mistakes that were made by American policymakers in 2020. And countries like Germany that seem to be doing well are not. On the other hand, some countries are still in the lead, and those are mostly the ones in East Asia. And so the point I made in the article that it's not democracy so much as other characteristics, I think is still correct. Taiwan has a vanishingly small number of COVID deaths, but it's a perfectly good democracy. And actually, its per capita death rate is lower than that of communist China, an authoritarian dictatorship. There are other very curious things that have happened since then. So in that article, I was expecting COVID to really ravage many poor countries because they lacked basic state capacity, public health systems and the like, but it's turning out that India's death rate is much lower than anyone expected last year. In sub-Saharan Africa, the COVID epidemic has not spread as rapidly or has done nearly as much damage. But in other parts of the developing world, it has. So Latin America has suffered very grievously. There's a rather interesting review of all of this evidence in the current issue of New York Magazine, which just, I think it doesn't answer the question of who did well and who did poorly. It just points to the fact that the data right now is very, very confusing. Now, the second part of your question on what kind of effect the pandemic had on liberal democracy around the world, I think is easier to answer. Freedom House, the organization that rates the level of freedom around the world on an annual basis and has been doing this for decades, just published last week its latest Freedom in the World survey, which covers the year 2020. And it's very disturbing because it notes that this is the 15th straight year in which freedom across the entire globe has declined. And in fact, it declined more rapidly in 2020 than in previous years. And that was true for some really big countries. And so it's now put India with its whatever 1.3, 1.4 billion people in a kind of borderline not free category, which is a really big shift. And it also downgraded the United States quite considerably. So it was not a good year for liberal democracy. A lot of that was directly related to the pandemic because there are many countries that use the pandemic as an excuse to increase the executive power in their systems. This happened in Hungary with Viktor Orban early on. It happened with President Bukele in El Salvador, in Uganda, in many other places. Leaders grabbed power, and the strong suspicion is that once the epidemic lifts, they're not going to give it back. China extended its national security law over Hong Kong last winter, and I think they probably would not have done that had it not been for COVID, but I think they figured that the world's attention was focused elsewhere due to the pandemic and that they could get away with it more easily than they could in 2019.
Do you think that this sort of democratic backsliding that we've seen accelerate in 2020 because of the pandemic will cause states to recommit to their own internal security and internal functioning? Or do you think that it will produce more conflict in the future because of democratic backsliding?
Well, it could do both, and it could also have some good effects. So, one thing that's happened because of the pandemic is that, in 2019 and the years just before that, there actually were quite a lot of popular mobilizations against dictatorship. This happened in a number of surprising places. It happened in Algeria, it happened in Sudan, it happened in Armenia, happened in Nicaragua, it happened in Belarus, which had been one of the most authoritarian of all of the successor states of the former Soviet Union. And then all of a sudden, a lot of that came to a halt in 2020, either because governments had regained their self-confidence and mobilized against them, or because it simply became hard to demonstrate in the middle of a pandemic when people were worried about social distancing and the like. But we don't know what really is going to happen once the pandemic conditions lift, because I think that many people around the world are actually quite unhappy about the performance of their governments, and they've got a lot of reason to protest. And so once it becomes, easier to do that, maybe we'll see an explosion of kind of new energy of the sort that we saw, last summer in the United States with all of the racial justice protests. But on the whole, I think that we're in a pretty difficult period for democracy because of the consolidation of power of Russia and particularly China, which have been much more willing to promote their model and to extend their influence beyond their borders than had been true in previous years, as well as the rise of populism inside many countries that we thought were securely liberal democracies.
In terms of the way the pandemic has affected individuals, and especially in multicultural countries, we've seen there is some disparity in the effects between different races, different socioeconomic classes. And I know that you have recently written a lot on identity and identity politics. How do you think the pandemic will affect that currently and in the future?
Um, it's hard to say. I think in the United States, the pandemic actually had some positive political consequences. I think people were aware that African Americans and other minorities had been dying of the disease at higher rates, and so there was some effort to make sure that they had access to the vaccine and to greater levels of care. It's resulted in a big stimulus bill that was just passed recently by the new administration that would, try to, do a redistribution of income and wealth towards people that were less privileged. So in that sense, it's probably helped to some extent to ease those inequalities. On the other hand, I think that in other countries, and especially the ones that I mentioned, where you've got leaders with authoritarian tendencies, it's probably served to further entrench them. They weren't doing much about these issues to begin with, and I think they're likely to continue. And of course, you've seen the contribution of the pandemic to nationalism. It's taken different forms. It's taken the form of leaders blaming other countries for having started the epidemic. It's taken the form of vaccine nationalism, where a lot of different powers are trying to use their ability to promote their vaccines as a way of increasing their national prestige and the like. You've also, I think, seen this complete drop in international trade um, because of the pandemic. The drying up of air travel and tourism and a lot of other forms of international commerce, which obviously leads to a less open world order. Those latter issues, I think, are probably going to be reversed, and maybe reversed in a big way as soon as the vaccination spread, and it looks like the uh, epidemic has gotten under control, because there is a great deal of pent up um, spending power and certainly interest in getting out and about again in many places. First and foremost, the United States. So if we were to talk about this again in 6 months, I think things may look actually quite different.
Hmm. And in terms of, you mentioned the world order, do you think that the pandemic identified any weaknesses or fissures in the world order and will lead to the world order usefully sort of addressing those fissures, or do you think that the pandemic really hurt the world order, and that the world order will struggle to build any resilience out of this experience in which many countries failed to respond properly and international institutions didn't function properly in response to, a global crisis?
Yeah, I think that definitely the crisis exposed weaknesses. Even compared to the financial crisis in 2008, there was less of a coordinated international response. And this is an area where there should have been, early cooperation. And that has a lot of sources. I mean, to this day, China has not been very open. I do think that they exerted undue pressure on the WHO to downplay the crisis in the early days, and they're really not permitting international health experts to really find out what the origin of the disease was. And so that really critical global health organization has not been able to function amidst all of this finger pointing and effort to shift blame. And then once the crisis got going, I think, the Trump administration did all these very counterproductive things like, pulling out of the WHO and saying that they were going to end funding to it right at the moment when the WHO becomes, more important than ever. I think that we're probably going to see a big shift in those sorts of policies, trying to rejoin those international institutions. And I don't think that damage especially in these foreign policy issues, is ever permanent. But I do think that the level of distrust is much greater internationally. And I also think that there's a long-term damage that's been done in American foreign policy. There are many allied countries in Europe and in Asia that have depended for decades on an American promise of support and American alliances. Although the Biden administration has made a big effort to reassure those countries that America is back and that it continues to support them, I think the fact that the country remains as internally polarized, that is to say, the United States remains as internally polarized as it is, makes a lot of those allies wonder whether they can really count on the United States, or whether in 2 years we'll have another election that will set the country off in a different direction. And that's something that's not so easy to repair.
In terms of polarization in the United States, obviously isolation, quarantine, social distancing hasn't necessarily been good for public discourse in a civil format. Has there been similar trends around the world? And do you think that once the world reopens and once people are beginning to engage in public again, that public discourse will improve?
This all depends, I think, on the specific country. I think that the United States had special problems because we went into the crisis already highly polarized, and rather than bringing Americans together, the health crisis, actually further polarized us, so that a simple health measure like wearing a mask became a political statement that you were either for or against, depending on your political allegiance, rather than any kind of, neutral observation of health requirements and that sort of thing. So, but that's different, from other countries that weren't as polar. I mean, New Zealand, for example, went through the crisis extremely well. They had very low levels of infections and diseases. They were able to do contact tracing and isolation of the few cases they had, so they really were able to stamp out the disease very early on. You can see on the internet, these pictures of this big, gigantic New Year's celebration where they're all out in a big crowd without masks, celebrating because they'd managed to, conquer the disease. And so in a country like that, I think that this probably increased social solidarity rather than weakened it. But I would say that in many countries, the overall effect is been to weaken that sense of solidarity. And I think part of the reason is the length of time that the shutdowns and the health mandates have gone on, because I think people just, even if they intellectually understand the reasons for it, get tired and grouchy, and this expresses itself politically, which is why European governments that are facing even now rising levels of infections are finding it impossible to get people to comply with yet another round of closures.
Pivoting to sort of another topic that you've briefly touched on when you discussed the WHO, but more specifically bilaterally between the United States and China. How do you think that the pandemic has affected that relationship, as well as the fact that that relationship has become increasingly conflictual? Do you think the pandemic worsened that, or do you think that the pandemic helped that? How do you think the pandemic has affected that relationship?
I actually don't think the pandemic in the long run is going to affect the relationship all that much. Uh, I think that um, the rift between the US and China is built on much broader foundations. Ever since Xi Jinping rose to power in 2013, the Chinese regime has been moving in a more overtly totalitarian direction. It's taken away many of the individual liberties that Chinese people used to enjoy. You know, I remember 10 years ago, I could travel to China and be in an open discussion in a university where, you know, many professors would criticize the way their government was doing things. And you can't do that in China anymore. They've put in place a surveillance system that is unlike any we've seen previously. Their social credit system, they've basically jailed an entire uh, ethnic group, you know, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and finally, you know, they've made these geopolitical moves like the Belt and Road Initiative, and then the militarization of the islands in the South China Sea, which you folks in the Navy are going to have your hands full dealing with in the next generation, all of which signal a very, very different kind of China than the one that we had been dealing with in the 30 years prior to Xi's rise. And that's one area where I think there's a fair amount of bipartisan agreement that this is a big problem and a big challenge. The relationship is just not going to go back to the kind of pragmatic one based on trade that had existed, you know, prior to the last few years. And I just think that the pandemic, you know, it gave the Trump administration a way of trying to shift the blame uh, onto China. But I think in the long run, it's not going to alter the overall trajectory towards a more you know, kind of hostile and rivalrous relationship between the two countries.
In terms of other countries around the world, or more specifically between Western Europe and the United States, or the United States and Russia, do you think that the pandemic has had a serious impact on any of those bilateral relationships, or do you think that those are more affected by long-term trends in politics, economics, and society?
I think the impact of the pandemic is going to be fairly indirect. You know, there's one sense in which it helped a lot because I think that back a year ago, you know, Donald Trump was headed towards getting reelected for a second term because the economy was doing very well and the you know the epidemic hadn't hit, and then he lost that election, and he is not a great advocate of alliances or a great supporter of our foreign commitments. And so, in that respect, you know, his replacement by Joe Biden is going to strengthen those relationships. You know, Trump managed to go after everybody simultaneously. So he went after China, but he also went after all of the allies like Korea, Japan, the NATO allies at the same time, all of whom would be really necessary if you're going to build a broad front of democratic countries to contain China. So in that respect, I think the decks have been cleared for a more coordinated policy in which these bilateral trade issues are not allowed to undermine basic security relationships. And again, you know, I mean, to be fair, all American presidents have complained about allies not doing enough. I mean, this is a bigger problem in the case of, let's say, Germany than it is in the case of South Korea. But you know, it's been a longstanding complaint of virtually every American president, and obviously they could do more to see to their own security. But you know, you don't need to put unnecessary obstacles in the way of trust and cooperation between countries that basically share a commitment to democratic values.
Shifting now towards sort of trade and economics, which you briefly touched on, do you think that when economies all over the world begin to reopen, that things will return to a pre-pandemic format, or do you think there will be radical changes as part of this new normal in how the international economic system functions?
I think actually neither of those is going to happen. We're not going to go back to the old system, but we're not going to see something radically different, or at least I hope we don't. Um, I think that actually I believe it was Ron Klain, Biden's new chief of staff, but it may have been Blinken. One of the new senior members of his circle gave actually a very interesting speech talking about China and globalization and how they were going to handle it differently. And what he said was basically under the old version of globalization, and this was true both for George W. Bush, a Republican, and Barack Obama, a Democrat. Um, Policymakers saw their job as opening doors for American investment banks like Goldman Sachs or pharmaceutical companies or other big corporate interests, that was what they were defending in promoting a globalized order. And they were not that interested in the welfare of working class Americans or the effect that this would have on American jobs, on supply chains that might be vulnerable. Um, Basically, for a good 20-year period from during the 1990s and early 2000s, if a corporation could squeeze the least, the smallest amount of money and efficiency out of the system by moving its supply chain to a country with lower um, labor costs, they would do that. And I think that many of them are now under the gun. I mean, for a couple of different reasons. I mean, politically, they're under the gun to pay more attention to jobs in the United States. But also, I think that the pandemic, in a way, coming on top of Trump's trade war, has revealed that our supply chains are very vulnerable. In the early days of the pandemic, you couldn't get PPE gear because most of it was made in China and other places where the supply was very constricted. If you look at things like semiconductors, if you want something really to worry about, so much high-end semiconductor manufacturing is now done in Taiwan or in China with Taiwanese factories, that a conflict involving China and Taiwan is going to be absolutely devastating to American automakers who completely depend on having an adequate supply of chips. And so, when you're planning as a corporate supply manager, there's a trade-off. You can either go for maximizing your short-term profits, or you can go for resilience. You can think about, what will happen in the case of future hurricanes and typhoons or earthquakes or political conflict or new pandemics that may arise in the future. And I think that uh, whereas 10, 15 years ago, people would have picked the efficiency pole of that trade-off. Today, they're going to think a little bit harder about how to build resilience into these systems. And they're going to be under the gun, I think, to worry a little bit more than they did about American workers.
Hmm. In terms of kind of you touched on resilience, on specifically corporations building resilience, but in terms of governments and countries around the world building resilience for another um, international crisis, be it a climate crisis, another pandemic, a natural disaster, something of that nature. Do you think that the international community is capable of learning and of preventing the kind of massive loss of life and the massive economic and just personal crisis for so many people around the world? Or do you think that we'll just see a reversion, like after the Spanish flu, where governments and people are just sort of unwilling to grapple with the reality of the possibility of an upcoming crisis?
Oh, I think they'll be learning. I think that's kind of inevitable. And you can already see that, happening. I mean, for example, I think one of the reasons that Taiwan and South Korea and China, Japan did better than other countries in dealing with this pandemic was that they went through the SARS crisis a number of years ago. And at the time of the SARS crisis, a lot of them simply were not prepared. They got hit, they got blindsided, they didn't prepare adequately, they didn't respond quickly enough. And I think because of that experience, they were much better prepared than other countries that didn't experience SARS to move, fast to head off this new epidemic. And so I do think that there's learning, and it's going to be it. I find it hard to conceive of a United States that doesn't realize it's got to bolster its health, its public health infrastructure, and make efforts to create cooperative structures that will give policymakers greater warning time. Whether you're going to be willing to invest substantially more resources in that, that's a different question. Because there are trade-offs, and it's always harder to make these investments in things that may not pay off for some time to come than in things that will get you elected next election cycle. But I do think that there's simple things that can be done, like having a White House office that specializes in these kinds of public health issues. These are things, they're relatively simple things that people can do. The other thing that I think is particularly important for people at an institution like the Naval Academy is just thinking about security in very different ways, because we have had this kind of kinetic hard power understanding of what serious security issues are. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has underlined is the fact that there are many other threats to security. I mean, if you think about the economic losses that the world has suffered as a result of the pandemic, I mean, it's in the trillions of dollars. It's really something very massive that affects, among other things, military readiness. And so I think that, the kind of awareness that security really has to involve a lot of other dimensions other than the kind of traditional kinetic ones is something that people were aware of, but there's nothing like actually going through a crisis like this to to plant that image firmly in people's minds.
Okay. Dr. Fukuyama, my final question is, what is one thing that will be part of the new normal that wasn't part of the old normal that you think will be actually valuable? It could be either personal, or it could be in terms of the international order. This is just sort of a question we're posing to all of our speakers and contributors, to kind of highlight building resilience, highlight the ways in which the pandemic may be benefiting society, despite the incredible losses and tragedy of the past year.
Well, one thing that I think will obviously happen is something like what we're doing now. I think that the possibility of moving to online communication and interaction was always there, but people were just reluctant to do it out of inertia. But they've been forced to for a year now, and so this affects me a great deal because I, in my previous life, would be on an international flight, basically once a month, and I haven't flown at all since then. And I think that a lot of organizations are going to realize that they don't actually have to put people on airplanes and they don't have to physically move around, that they can accomplish the same thing, over the internet that they used to have to do in person. And that's going to have a big effect on the wear and tear on individuals. It's going to change the nature of travel and the travel industry, I think, quite substantially. And it actually may improve the ability to actually communicate and collaborate, because we're discovering that there are sort of easy ways of doing it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. On behalf of the United States Naval Academy and the United States Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference and all of our delegates, thank you for contributing to our conference. Thank you for your thoughts and your perspective, and we really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you for having me.
The Honorable Stanley LeGros of Rancho Santa Fe passed away on Monday, August 17, 2020, in La Jolla, California. Mr. LeGros graduated first in the class of 1959 at the U.S. Naval Academy, and following graduation, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps. He resigned his commission to attend Harvard Law School, where he was a member of the Law Review. He also taught as an adjunct lecturer at the University of San Diego School of Law. Later in his career, he practiced law in Washington, D.C., and was of counsel at what is now DLA Piper. Public service was an important part of Mr. LeGros' life, and he served as a member of the San Diego Planning Commission and as a board member of the Citizens Democracy Corps. He was also appointed Assistant Administrator for Enforcement at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency during the Ford administration, and he remained active in environmental causes following his retirement. We are grateful to the Honorable Stanley LeGros for all he did throughout his life to support the Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference.